Hi, my name is Wimshurst. I'm a commercial animator, I'm a digital artist, and I'm a YouTuber. I've had the experience of creating over 170 original thumbnails for YouTube. 170! That has given me a lot of experience and a lot of opportunities to experiment with what works and what didn't work for me. And I've tried to learn from each one of them and kind of gather some data on what seems to work. And then I've come up with some theories of why certain things work, why you want to click on certain videos. Like sometimes you see a thumbnail and you're just like, I gotta click it. I'm gonna try and explain why that is sometimes. There's an art to creating thumbnails. It's a sort of craft, I think. And I want to teach you how I go about that craft. Clarity. So unlike a normal piece of artwork, a thumbnail needs to be able to retain its clarity from a very small size. I go about this in 3 major ways. First of all, is I reduce the number of focal points to like between 1 and 3. So it can have just 1 focal point, right, usually in the middle, or I can have 2 focal points or 3, but 3 is starting to get a little bit complex, so you need to be careful with that. But I wouldn't go over 3. Focal points are like places in the image where the eye is designed to go to. Having clearly readable silhouettes is another one, and also having clearly defined shapes. I think that is very important as well, such as this thumbnail here that I created. We are instinctively drawn towards areas of contrast. So typically, if your thumbnail has more contrast in it than the thumbnails surrounding it, then the human eye is most likely to magnetically be drawn to your thumbnail and not the other ones that are surrounding it. So in color theory, the highest range of contrast you can go to is white and black. So I think that if you have white and black close together, that can work really well. That's like a big boost of contrast that can help your image. A lot of the time thumbnails with white and black do really well, but you can also have contrast in other aspects of your artwork as well. You can also have contrast in color. The way you can do this is by having opposite colors on the color wheel. I want to talk about colors more specifically. It could be a hunch, but I believe that the color red is a very good color for thumbnails. I personally like using the color red in thumbnails. You will probably be able to tell this from my thumbnails. Basically anywhere I can get away with adding a flash of red, I'll try and take it. It comes down to animal instincts about the natural world from where we evolved from. In the natural world, the color red has certain significance. The color red is, in a way, it's rare. The color red represents things like blood, berries, the crests of certain animals. These are things that we needed to be aware of. So our brains are almost like hardwired to see red and to just be like, red thing, red thing, red thing. The other one is yellow. Yellow is a very good color as well. So reds and yellows are particularly strong in thumbnails. Now, if we add that to the previous point, so we've got those 2 colors that work really well, and then we add that to the contrast thing. So red and black, I've found work very well. Yellow and black work very well. Yellow is high in value. It's a light color. So when you pair that with black, it also has high contrast. Think of like danger signs at the side of the road. They're yellow and black because they want to use the colors that you're most likely to pay attention to. So that's a good example of how yellow and black is used in that way. Faces and eye contact. As animals, direct eye contact triggers something in our brains. Especially as social creatures, we pay particular attention to the whites of someone's eyes, because the whites of someone's eyes versus the pupils, when we put the 2 together, the pupils and the whites, they indicate where we're looking. They also indicate expressions. They indicate whether you're angry, sad, happy, and those are very important for social animals. You can see in this example, this was actually commissioned by Yuku and Lily, and I created some thumbnails for them as well. Now, I accentuated the whites of her eyes, and as soon as I did that, when I bumped up the brightness and the whites of her eyes, man, it was like such a powerful image all of a sudden. So it worked really well there. That was just a draft one. It didn't end up getting used, but that made such a difference. So similar to that, we can use the same example here to show another principle called visual interest, or just detail. So I added these little white patterns onto her face. They're kind of like Mike Tyson tattoos. I did that so that I could give the audience more visual interest to look at. The human eye is more likely to spend time on an image if there are pleasing patterns with some intricacy to them. Next is 3D depth. So for this one, you place a vanishing point somewhere in the frame, and what that does is it makes it feel like the subject is coming out of the frame at you. This is a very, very powerful, instinctive tool, a tool that appeals to our very deep animal instincts again. We are most likely to pay attention to things which are coming at us. At you. I will do this, I'll do at you. See that? You're going to pay attention to that because as an animal, you would perceive that as a potential threat. Very powerful tool. And to do that, I just use 1 point perspective usually. Okay, so these things have been pretty basic so far. Now I'm going to get a little bit more advanced with you. And this one is going to be called making a promise to your audience. One of the things that I have as my kind of style trait, which you'll have noticed, is that I like arrows. I like putting little arrows on my thumbnails. Why do I do this? How does it help? What it's doing is it's basically making a promise to the audience, creating a contract with the audience to say, if you click on this video, I'm going to teach you something that you didn't know before. If I'm able to explain a concept just with some arrows to get a very basic idea across to you, then you've learned something. Even before you clicked on the video, you've already learned something. So it's like a free sample. If I'm able to teach you something without you even clicking on the video, imagine how much information is going to be in the video. A lot, right? There's going to be more stuff for you to learn and find out in the video. This is an interesting one. Should you have text on your thumbnail? Should you not have text on your thumbnail? Text on thumbnail is a double-edged sword, I believe. I think for people starting out, it's a very reliable way to make a professional looking thumbnail. Portrays a professional, well thought out presentation on an idea. On the other hand, it's kind of a convention used by YouTubers. The audience, the potential viewer, is going to perceive it as a standard YouTube video, not something special necessarily. You're also removing ambiguity and intrigue. You're slapping a label on your video, telling the audience exactly what it is, and then they won't use their imagination and fill in the gaps and think for themselves about what it is. Some of the best advertisements and pieces of art I've ever seen are the ones which don't explicitly tell you the answers. They leave room for your imagination to fill it out and for you to ask questions. Why do you think there's never any art in an art gallery that has wording on it? Because they want you to think, they want you to use your imagination, they want to keep you curious and intrigued. If you put words on it, you define it, you say what it is. Alright, so that brings me to ambiguity. Now, this is one of the most interesting topics, I think, in art altogether, really. It's a difficult one to balance though, because if you make something too ambiguous, then it just confuses the viewer, and that's not necessarily good. If you don't do it enough, you give too much information and then the mystery is gone and then they have no real reason to click. So if let's say your thumbnail and title just make a statement, the viewer doesn't need to click on the video because they're told everything they need to know in the video title. When I really started to learn about the power of ambiguity was when I started looking into famous artists like David Lynch And I found that in interviews, they basically refused to say what their films were about. And so because they did that, the film was allowed to be many different things to many different people. If they had chosen to define their work, to actually explain exactly what the work was about, then it wouldn't have that same appeal. One of the other obvious things I should mention is quality. You know, if you invest time into a quality image for your thumbnail, then it suggests to the potential viewer that the video will also have quality. So I've talked a lot about the major theories, and now I'm going to show you my process with how I actually create a thumbnail as a sort of practical example of it. I approach the thumbnail process like a real piece of art that I would do. I put in research to it, I think about it a lot before I actually go and do it, and I put way too much time into my thumbnails. The first place I might start is by actually just skimming through the video that I've just made. I usually make the video first before I make the thumbnail, and I'll skim through the video and see if there are any frames that I can pick up in the video itself that have potential to be an effective thumbnail. It could be a work in progress piece of animation or artwork, or it could be a picture of me explaining a concept. At the same time that I'm creating the idea for the thumbnail, I'll also be thinking about the wording of the title. And remember that you don't need to repeat information in your thumbnail and title. You can actually give some information in your thumbnail about the video and some information in your title, and together they will create a bigger picture of what your video is about. I might actually create iterations of the ideas in Photoshop and like try to Photoshop each one and take each one a little bit further until I can see, yeah, that one's not going to be as good as this one. And so I'm also narrowing them down in that time. The other cool trick that I use is I just either zoom out or I just try to preview it as the size of the thumbnail it's going to be, because that way you can actually see what the thumbnail is going to behave like at that small size. And from there you can see which one is most readable, which one's got the most clarity, and which one still works in that thumbnail size. For these shots where I'm looking at the camera or something, I might actually go and reshoot some of the images just to get the right kind of photo for the thumbnail. That's something that I sometimes do. The way I do that is I just leave the camera recording as video, and then I will take that onto my computer and take certain screenshots of certain frames that I like from that, and I'll bring them into Photoshop and use them as the basis of my thumbnail. While the camera is rolling from that shoot, I'll be trying a bunch of different things, because you don't really know what's going to work well as a good thumbnail until you get it back into your computer and you look at them from that small thumbnail size. So just try a bunch of things when you're trying to create a thumbnail at first, and then narrow them down later. So once I have that kind of image basis for the thumbnail, then I will take it into Photoshop and I'll get to work doing the creative stuff and really kind of designing what the thumbnail is going to look like, thinking about composition, lighting, and things like that. If I've got a very complex image, I'll usually start off by trying to reduce the detail that's not really needed. So I might do that just by lightly brushing over, like let's say this was a thumbnail here that you're seeing. I might just brush over the things in the background. You see these areas of high contrast that are kind of leading away from my face, or back here. I might just brush over them a little bit with like a blue color or some kind of color tinge, and that just reduces the contrast of areas that you're not meant to be looking at, and that will then guide focus to the areas of high contrast, which I would retain, which would be usually the foreground subject. It would be me in this case. So I'll use a bunch of different filters. I'll use the curves, I'll bump up the exposure and the contrast. I will also sometimes add in a sort of textured overlay. So I have these texture images, which are like kind of gradient textures. I'll bring one of them in, and then I'll just like set it to overlay or one of the other blending modes. Of course, I love color dodge. Color dodge is a great blending mode because it just adds that nice burst of color into the image, which is really going to make it stand out on YouTube. Sometimes I might add a lens flare at this stage, just that little extra bit of visual detail, a bit of richness. Motion blurs are great because then it makes it feel like the image is in motion. And so I will often add motion blurs to things. In the planning stage, I'll often also look for images which have a feel like they're not static, like they're moving. Something that feels like it's been captured while it's been in motion. And you'll see that as a recurring theme in a lot of my thumbnails. Now I've got this other really good hack that I've developed, and this is basically what I do for this is I add a radial blur to the image, and then I'll mask it out so that it's just on the outsides, the outer edges. So I'll give the outer edges this radial blur effect, and man, this bumps up the intensity to like 100. It makes the thumbnail so intense, and it's just like one of my favorite tricks to pull on a thumbnail. There you have it. That's one of my best tricks up my sleeve for thumbnails. So for inspiration, there are lots of places you can look for inspiration. One of them is just YouTube, and some people are really good at thumbnails, and you can just take inspiration every time you see a thumbnail that makes you want to click on it. Like, especially the ones where you're not particularly interested in the subject of the video, but for some reason you just like, man, I want to click on that video. Those are effective thumbnails, so you should be looking at them and thinking like, what is it about that thumbnail, and deconstruct it. The other thing that I look at is photography. Of course, I'm a big fan of photography. I'm always looking to photography for inspiration in my animations and in my artwork, because that's where you find some of the most innovative compositions, especially like historic photography. I will look back at them and deconstruct them and think like, why is that image so captivating? And that's been a big influence on me for thumbnails. All right, that'll do it. I think if you follow those tips, you can make some really effective thumbnails that draw people in. Don't abuse it, of course, don't manipulate people with it, but at the same time, it's one of the foundations for success on YouTube and on social media in general. So it's an incredibly powerful skill to be able to create a captivating thumbnail, and you can use these skills for good. And that's what I would recommend. Don't use them for bad things, use them for good, because they are very powerful. You can subscribe down below to see new videos when I make them. This channel is all about the art of animation and creative storytelling. I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.